Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 200 Years of Life, Part 2 by Ben Woodard. This seminar tracks the history, politics, and philosophy of biology over the last 200 years, since it cohered as a scientific discipline in the early 1800s. It breaks out of two critical dead ends in interpreting biology: the political and historical limitations of analytic treatments of biology, and the disregard for biological history and scientific detail in continental philosophical discourses around the life sciences. By focusing on the latter half of the 20th century, Part 2 of the seminar will emphasize how technical expertise and experimental praxis are marshaled both for and against a value-neutral articulation of biology. This false neutrality, especially pervasive following the end of the Cold War, has allowed the political center to shift to the right, resuscitating historically naive discussions of eugenics, race, IQ, and human experimentation. As we will see, this train of thought is opposed, at times at the cost of oversimplification, to both post-genomic understandings of evolutionary history and a too eager valorization of organismic agency or teleology. Ben Woodard is currently a fellow at the ICI Berlin. He received his PhD in Theory and Criticism from Western University in 2016. From 2017 to 2020, he was a postdoctoral researcher at the IPK at Leuphana University, where he completed a habilitation on the analytic continental divide in philosophy through the work of F. H. Bradley. Since 2020, Ben has lectured at the Melbourne School of Continental Philosophy, mostly on the history, philosophy, and politics of the life sciences. In broad terms, his work focuses on the relationship between naturalism and idealism. In the long 19th century, Ben also writes on science fiction and horror film and literature. He is the author of numerous articles and 3 books: Slime Dynamics, Generation, Mutation, and the Creep of Life, 2012, on an undergrounded Earth, Towards a New Geophilosophy, Punctum 2013, and Schelling's Naturalism, Motion, Space, and the Volition of Thought, Edinburgh 2019. I give the word to you, Ben.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the introduction and for running the session. And hello to everyone. So some of the names I recognize from the last seminar. And of course, it's good to say at the outset, if you weren't in that one, that's not a problem, of course. This course just covers a different time frame, but there won't be too much assumption of knowledge from that other class. If you were in the previous class, there'll be some repetition, no doubt, in terms of concepts and things like this. But yeah, as I said, very different topics will come up, of course. Yeah, so just to say, the kind of idea for the course is to try and balance the difference between the kind of politics, the philosophy, and the history, while really trying to understand what is actually happening on like an empirical level and a sort of research, sort of specific forms of the research, what kind of knowledge is actually being produced, because having, worked on this kind of history, philosophy, and politics of biology for about 5 years now, as a sort of main focus, it's very, very difficult to present all these things in some kind of balance. So the hope is to try to do that over the course of these lessons. Today, I will probably talk more than I would normally like. So I'm hoping there'll be more discussion as time goes on. And also today's class will be much more theoretically heavy, much more philosophically heavy than probably some of the later ones. So with that, I guess I will start. And then we can do introductions of everyone at the end of today's class if there's time, or we can do it at the beginning of next week. But with that, I will put up my slides really quick. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that. Okay. So I won't go through this is just the same text from the description. I won't go through this in great detail, but just to kind of emphasize some of the conceptual things that we will talk about, right? It's set up to be roughly in chronological order, but there will be some jumping back and forth in terms of talking about which kinds of ideas or concepts need to be understood. So what I'll say, the things that sort of aren't written here in terms of today's class, the idea is to talk about the different ways in which the history of biology, especially starting in the 20th century, is told, and it's told in different narratives that don't agree or often directly contradict one another. And then talk about how remnants of those different narratives still kind of haunt us in various ways. And then to sort of talk about what the place of philosophy is in relationship to biology, both in the continental sense and in the analytic sense, while also talking about things like science and technology studies and history of science as kind of being used by both sides there. And then talking a lot about the role of concepts and what concepts kind of do in the situation of how we understand, the history of biology is repeating itself or not based on the kinds of concepts it wants to hold on to or the ones it's willing to let go of. And then next week there'll be much more politics involved in next week, especially since starting in the 60s and 70s and 80s, a lot of emphasis on trying to sort of figure out the biological grounds of human beings, and this whole attempt to really define genetically or physiologically or otherwise behavior and instinct and these kinds of notions. And of course, this will ground sociobiology and the different ways we want to say genetics influences organisms in the singular and also in different kinds of groups. So a lot of discussion of levels next week. Then the third week, talk about genomics and the various sciences around that. So once DNA sequencing and so sequencing and genetic studies can be done more cheaply at larger and larger scales. What does this mean for biology, but also what does this mean for how biology functions in the kind of popular consciousness? Like that changes quite drastically once we get into the 90s in particular, but then already in the 80s, you have biotechnology really kicking off, sort of industrial processes, industrialization of transgenic organisms, all this kind of thing really gets going. And then the kind of failure or attempts to create an overly simplistic genetic model of organisms, humans and otherwise, and what that leads to, which will then be the final week, talking about post-genomics, right? Trying to deal with the kind of insufficiency of the genetic program to describe behaviors or capacities of organisms and the kind of turn against that, and then the kind of counter moves of the more gene-centric people. And then talking about where epigenetics and other forms of post-genomics is really a contemporary, not only scientific problem, biological problem, but also very relevant to how we understand genetic medicine, to discourses about race in particular will be very important when we talk about post-genomics. Which categories are still being used by scientists as if they are empirical categories when they are in fact historical categories and this sort of thing. And I mean, just to sort of lay out, I guess, sort of bias, or one of the reasons why I started doing a lot of this work is in part because I felt, and this will come up, that in a lot of continental philosophy and also in a lot of leftist politics, there's a sort of not much understanding of the history of biology, or at least not much understanding of contemporary biology. And even if you don't care about biology historically or empirically, which is fine, it puts a lot of people at a political disadvantage because a lot of people on the right, and even more so on the alt-right, are perfectly happy not only to read these scientific articles, to invite these people to speak to them and so on, but the right, in particular the alt-right, has gotten very good at producing scientific-like or scientific-looking essays and bits of information, even hijacking, in particular, liberal funding bodies and liberal modes of doing science, such as citizen science or open science. And so I feel like there's not nearly enough knowledge in some places to combat this. And so that's part of the motivation for what I'm doing. So that's kind of in the background of a lot of this kind of work. Yeah. Okay. So first, a couple of likely stories or fables in biology. So when talking about modern biology, or talking about the birth of classic genetics, for instance, the story typically goes like this. After, a lot of supposedly non-empirical or not very, rigorous forms of science and studies of organisms, in the 20th century, people finally take Darwinian evolution seriously, the rediscovery of Gregor Mendel, right, early works in genetics, and they start to do these, more robust forms of experimentation. So one of the more famous figures is T.H. Morgan, which both of these books is about the work that he did, producing one of the first sort of genetic studies by trying to figure out how chromosomes worked and interacted, right? So you had, in the 1920s and the 1930s, tons of labs all across the world, quite a few in the US, producing, studies by breeding fruit flies, right? Drosophila melanogaster, that's the species pictured there. Breeding them until you get a mutation, then taking the mutant, then breeding the mutant with flies you had caught in the wild, so-called wild type, breeding those until you get the mutation, taking it out, right? And then breeding flies until you get even more radical mutations. How many generations does that take, right? And so by doing this, right, over and over and over again, you get a sort of map of the chromosomes, right? You sort of get a sense of, okay, these parts of the fly can mutate more readily than these parts of the fly. And so, even though we can't see genes or see the genetic material yet, we can kind of functionally track how resistant it is to change, right? So you kind of get this notion, and this gets copied and reduplicated all across the country. It was also very cheap. Fruit flies are everywhere people are. And you just have to feed them banana paste and have some jars. And then a lot of people, especially often was the time underpaid women, checking up and taking data on the flies. And this was a very cheap way to have a biology lab in the early 20th century. And so again, this is a fable. This is kind of a story that gets retold, that from this, what happens is that physics or physicists start flocking to biology in large numbers. And there's kind of sociological and theoretical reasons for this. There was a sense, especially after the war, or even leading up to the war, that a lot of the big problems in physics had been solved. People were still reeling from Einstein's work. There was, of course, ethical qualms or people being very uncomfortable on the one hand with the atomic bomb program, for instance, while on the other hand, for the first time, especially in the United States, you had huge amounts of money being dumped into the natural sciences, because unlike Europe or the UK or many other places in the world, there's always large allotments of government funding for science. This was not the case for a lot of the US's history. It was only through really the nuclear weapons program and the sort of War Department that you could convince politicians to give money to public projects, public research projects. And so there was a lot of opportunity there, and there was a lot of people who, with a background in physics, found ways in which they could readily apply their knowledge of statistics, of things like entropy, of how does organization work at the molecular or atomic level, how could these be applied to the biological sciences? And so you have people like Schrödinger writes this book, What is Life, in 1944, based on these lectures, which has a kind of almost fantastical role in a lot of biologists' imaginations, that this was the book that inspired them to do biology, and that this was the book that really, came up with the notion of DNA before it was really discovered, really seen. And with all of this, right, there's a notion that, or what's very important here is that it was building on a trend already in the 20th century that to do biology or to understand biological knowledge, one really had to find ways to look inside the organism. Right, so the sort of naturalism kind of mode of Darwin, or just studying the behavior of animals to an extent, was limited. And so it was really about, we need to understand like how life really functions in terms of the chemistry, right, in terms of metabolism, in terms of things like how does fermentation really work? How does medicine work? How do bacteria and viruses reproduce? How do hormones function? Right, all these kinds of questions start to be answered because you get a kind of industrial mode of chemistry in the 20s and 30s. Again, part of that comes out of World War I, not only. But so with that, you kind of get the sense that you start to look inside the organism, right, to have a kind of functional mechanist chemical understanding of organisms. And of course, part of this of course dovetails with the physicists, many of who start applying X-ray, X-rays to living organisms, either to see the fine structure of molecules or just to mutate the hell out of them, to see what happens with bacteria or flies. And so again, this kind of rosy typical story you get is that Watson and Crick show up and discover the helix, double helix structure of DNA. And then with this, right, this kind of becomes the crowning achievement of this kind of typical story. And this typical story gets to be called the modern synthesis. And this phrase comes, or is kind of popularized by Julian Huxley, the brother of Aldous Huxley and, grandson of T.H. Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, as he was known. And so Julian Huxley basically kind of tells the story I just told, though maybe not mentioning the money part, and sort of says, okay, like this is now proper biology. We've finally have put together Darwinian evolution with Mendelian genetics, and then using mathematical, statistical techniques and physics, biology can now be seen as a proper laboratory science. Right. So it's hard to imagine now, but even as late as the 1920s, 1930s, many philosophers of science or other scientists said, biology and evolutionary theory weren't properly scientific because they weren't laboratory experiments. You can't observe evolution in a lab, so it doesn't seem like an adequately empirical thing. And so Huxley kind of says, okay, we're past that now. It's all about genes and tracing genetic structures and statistics of populations. This is what's going to be biology. Okay. So that's, like I said, the typical kind of fable. But there's some complications there. One is that in this period where T.H. Morgan was doing his fly experiments that I mentioned, you have a whole complicated kind of combat between interpretations of genetics and which path to follow to try and understand them. And so one of the ways this gets complicated is you have these sort of two camps. So you have who are called the biometricians, where people like Ronald Fisher, Weldon, and Pearson, who are all sort of British mathematicians mostly, who applied the statistical theories of various complexity to the biological sciences. So the question is, why do this? So in the early 20th century, the notion of a gene, right, or the notion of genetics, right? The gene was not an observed thing, right? It was not an observed entity. It was not seen as necessarily even like a material structure, but there was, of course, a lot of interest and a lot of data and a lot of knowledge of heredity and the results of breeding programs with livestock and animal sciences, studies of animal physiology. And so the whole point was like, okay, well, there's something like a gene. We don't really know what it is at the chemical or molecular level, but we can like measure traits. We can measure traits over time among and between populations, and we can statistically kind of say how dominant or regressive certain traits are based on sort of intentionally simplistic model of genetics, right? But one that will allow us to map a population through, through this kind of various complex statistical models. So they were Darwinian. They were very much like saying natural selection occurs. There is a kind of how do populations regress towards the mean? How do we do all these things? Now, it probably won't come as a surprise that the biometricians were also deeply, deeply invested in eugenics. So to them, it was very much necessary to apply these animal husbandry, right, the study of breeding animals, to apply that to human beings. And they had different ways of doing that based on their backgrounds, but this was like, they were deeply, deeply invested in this. So on the other side, you had the figures like Bateson, William Bateson, so the grandfather of Gregory, T.H. Morgan, who I mentioned, doing the fly rooms, and then this guy Reginald Punnett, who studied moths and butterflies, and they were more interested in the physical or material function of the gene. And so they were more interested in variations and mutations. And they also saw themselves as being more Darwinian than the biometricians. Both sides saw themselves as being the proper Darwinians. But they were more interested in trying to observe, using also statistics to a extent, but also trying to observe how often certain mutations or variations would appear within a species, or to understand how common or uncommon certain morphologies or shapes of flowers or color types were, right? And so they saw evolution as occurring less in a kind of smooth way and more in a kind of jerky or kind of ruptured way. But this interpretation also gets very complicated, as we'll see. Okay. So, and one of the sort of complications here, and this again goes to this kind of rosy story that Huxley and other people still repeat to this day, is that, the biometricians were really right in the end because they saw evolution as slow and gradual, whereas the mutationists like Bateson, they were sort of obsessed with, like, they thought mutations caused new species all the time. And if you actually read what they wrote, this isn't the case. In fact, they believed in mutations and divergences in species, but they thought there were many layers of small changes even beneath that, so that they thought that the complexity of the organism was even more complex than the biometricians. So whereas the biometricians were happy with a kind of toy model of the gene, the mutationists really wanted to know the fine structure of all the different ways genes may or may not be a proper cause to change a species, right? So there's a really different view of how evolution worked, but the statistical, right, the biometric side of things was a much more tractable, much more simple, and that's the one that won out. That's the one that got sort of funded. That's the one that really is seen as part of the proper history of biology. And then also in this period, like just to sort of emphasize the role of mathematics and how late it was to biology, was the fact that many biologists didn't understand how genes kind of interacted with each other. And this was something that was really like a hard question at the kind of early 20th century. And so you have this famous moment where Punnett, the guy I mentioned who kind of studied mutations in moths and butterflies, I think he was playing cricket with J.H. Hardy, this famous mathematician. And he sort of didn't understand, you know, why don't human beings get like infinitely taller, right? Or like if one gene is dominant and one gene is regressive, why don't you always see the dominant gene win in this kind of sense? And Hardy said, well, that's really basic algebra. And he came up with this equation sort of showing, right, how, because what people didn't know is you could like see the dominant trait, see the recessive trait, but what people wanted to know was how many people have both genes but appear, you know, like for instance, how many people have brown eyes but have the genes for blue eyes in them. And Hardy came up with this very simple equation. This guy in Germany, Weinberg, came up with the same one. And so this is one of the kind of toy models that got used because it tells you basically how, quite straightforwardly, to figure out that people, like I said, show a sort of dominant feature but have the recessive genes by just doing very basic algebra and taking a small sample, right? But this is just to say mathematics was so novel and had a very kind of late, but then suddenly massive impact on the biological sciences in the early 20th century. Okay, so that's sort of one typical story, and then to kind of complicate it a bit. And then of course you have various counter narratives to this. And so part of the issue becomes how to integrate them, or to say maybe they shouldn't be integrated, maybe one is actually just correct. So for instance, you have the historian Lily Kay, who's written lots of articles kind of talking about all this kind of path towards genetics and all the work put into how genes and genetics come to be understood in this early 20th century into the sort of mid 20th century period. And she spends, you know, a lot of time talking about, as I already mentioned, right, this kind of military funding, but then also this Rockefeller Foundation, right, this huge sort of industrial magnet, just dumping tons of money into biology, and how this kind of one particular story about genetics becomes the kind of dominant one. And it very quickly, especially as we'll see after the war, after World War II, becomes hugely politicized. The other, you know, way you can kind of further trouble this narrative about, you know, this modern synthesis story, the story about, you know, how genetics came to be, how DNA came to be understood in the early 20th century is, you know, people may know this. It's been a lot has been written on this notion that, you know, Rosalind Franklin, who wasn't doing X-ray crystallography, right, that she actually technically discovered the structure of DNA, and that Watson and Crick stole it from her. I mean, they used her work, but didn't ask her for permission. But, you know, and then there's this whole ongoing debate, still now, you know, it's been going on for 50 years or more, who really discovered DNA. And to this day, you know, she's slandered by like sort of people who are fans of Watson and Crick and will say that, oh no, she wasn't a very good scientist or da 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 da. And then people hold her up as like a feminist hero, and other people say, well, she wasn't a feminist, but yes, she discovered it first. And so there's a whole, she's become kind of emblematic beyond whether or not she, you know, I mean, she did observe the structure through X-rays. That's, you know, empirically provable. She wrote it down, you know, in her journals. But this whole question of like who gets credit has also become, in general, a lot of people are wary to these counter narratives in general, right? Which is something we see a lot in the history of science, and also we see a lot more and more so in political understandings of history, right? This idea of revisionary history, and what does that actually mean? So she's become emblematic of even that mode of doing the history of biology. The other sort of, large elephant in the room is the ways in which many leftist biologists, especially in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, were impressed by and heavily influenced by Soviet biology. I'll talk about this more in detail in a second. But this notion of Lyshenko, right, this guy who kind of proposed a sort of non-genetic or non-genetically deterministic mode of biology, and then he sort of, rose to power quite quickly and pushed all these selective breeding programs emphasizing epigenetics. And this, was a sort of ecological disaster. That this also affected the ways in which scientists were even allowed to be seen as politically invested in a particular ideology or not. And so there's quite a lot about this, for instance, in Levins and Lewontin's book, The Dialectical Biologist, pictured here, where they kind of talk about what actually was meaningful and not in Lyshenko's work and this Soviet epigenetic program, botanical program. But even to this day, any biologists who are sympathetic to leftist causes in the 60s or 70s or even the 50s are seen as necessarily bad scientists. So again, just like Franklin has become, just how Rosalind Franklin has become emblematic of people wanting a counter narrative, Lyshenkoism and the kind of Soviet genetic program or epigenetic program is emblematic of like why politics should never be in biology, as if it's otherwise neutral, right? That's a kind of huge thing there. And then another kind of example of this counter story or another version of how the kind of typical narrative is pushed against or complicated is that you have increasingly, histories of emphasizing symbiosis or organicism or mutualism, not in the Soviet or Soviet sympathetic context, but in this context of a more kind of radical understanding, non-selfish understanding of genetics. And so Jan Sapp, whose book is pictured here, has been one of the biggest people in telling this story, telling the story of people like Lynn Margulis, for instance, right? This endosymbiotic theory of the origin of life, right? That the integration of life forms across species lines is just as important or maybe more important to the history of life than the gene, right? And so with this, you also have, as people may know, a lot of people from the 60s and 70s, and then now to this day, right, this mode of thinking biology is embraced often for political or ethical reasons as being less selfish, right, than the kind of typical genetic mode. So again, this is another sort of counter story to the typical genetic one. Okay, so just to talk about, so that's kind of various kind of competing fables, and we'll kind of return to them throughout today. And also, I think throughout the class, we'll kind of see them arise in different ways. But now I just wanted to talk, as I said, there'd be a bit more kind of philosophical, kind of more broad discussions of things today. And so, as I mentioned briefly, I think at the very beginning, when you say philosophy of biology, that's generally understood as it's an analytic philosophy, right? So it's an Anglo-American style philosophy discussing biology. And so with that, you have all the baggage that you have in terms of being very wary of metaphysics, in terms of often political or ethical concerns are reduced or not even talked about. And you get a very skewed form of like what's philosophically important for understanding biology. And so partially this is because, you had biology becomes a discipline around 1800, between 1800 and 1803. And then you have, 150 some years of biological work and also philosophizing about biology in various ways. You also have ancient, philosophy talking about concepts of life and things like this, of course. But then in the 1960s, analytic philosophy really kind of creates the discipline of the philosophy of biology. And so as a result, kind of obliterates a lot of the philosophical or philosophically interesting work, related to the life sciences. And so this book is like a typical example. They briefly discuss idealism, for instance, and think this has nothing to do with biology. Why would those things go together? And they kind of show they don't really understand, all these post-Kantian thinkers who were talking about life as a kind of process, and they just kind of constantly kind of negate and downplay the importance of a lot of this work and quickly skip, from Darwin to the 20th century. Again, kind of replaying this story of Julian Huxley's, like there's a lot of nonsense until we get to Darwin and then genetics, basically. And so it has this very skewed history. So this, I won't talk about my own work here, but this is just a kind of pedagogical tool that I've used frequently that I think is helpful. So I think these are kind of the four concepts that are kind of consistently fought over in biology in terms of which ones really matter, or sort of which ones are more important than the others at what times and which subdisciplines. And so, so I'll kind of just go through each of these, and then we'll kind of talk about how biology kind of relates to them differently over time. So agency is something that's gotten a lot more attention in the last 10 to 20 years, I would say. It was something that was initially very important post-Darwin, with Darwin's work, and then immediately post-Darwin, and then it kind of got less and less important until this maybe 1960s, I would say. And recently it's gotten a lot of attention. So agency is, again, people with a sort of theoretical background can guess, right? It's just the capacity to act, right? So it's essentially the capacity of organisms to act, particularly in novel conditions, in a goal-oriented manner. So one of the typical examples of this, and this is the picture, there are these little birds. They're called the blue tit. And back in the day when people had milk delivered to their door, they figured out how to peel the foil off these milk bottles, and they would drink just the fat at the top of the milk. And so there was nothing that these birds knew how to do in their, regular bird life that would kind of be like a similar skill, right? They learned this in order to get at this really, highly useful food, right? Incredibly dense, energy dense, food for them. And not only this, but they would teach other birds how to do it, right? And then the kind of cherry on top of this seeming to be a really goal-oriented, not accidental thing, was that once the milk became more homogenized and there was no longer this layer of fat at the top, they stopped doing it. It was no longer worth it for them. And so this is a sort of typical example of what would be seen as agency, right? They have a degree of self-reflexivity by which they can act in a goal-oriented manner, which does not seem easily explainable by simply instinctual or behavioral programming, because it transfers knowledge, it's new knowledge, it's then teachable, and so on. There's a lot you can debate about that, but that's the kind of gist. So then the next concept that I think is really central to kind of keep in mind is force. I always want to think maybe I should change this to process. Maybe that's a better word. But this is essentially the way in which organisms deal with their environment, right? So the ways in which organisms tap into or redirect natural forces or natural processes outside of their immediate need, right? So I put the North American beaver here because if people know how much about them, right, they construct these dams which block rivers and create these kind of wetlands type of habitats. So by doing this, they can move more safely, more quickly in the water, and they then build a house on the dams that they live in, which they're also very safe. But then by building these dams, they create a habitat which tons of animals come to, either to drink or birds come to eat the insects that are attracted to the water. Large mammals like bear or moose or wolves, things like this, deer, use the dams as like a bridge to cross the water because it's safer for them. And it also reduces damage by forest fires because it functions as a natural fire break because of having this water kind of spread out. And it also gives the water to the trees more evenly, right? So it has all these ecological effects. This kind of miniature ecosystem is created just by the action of this one animal, right? So that's kind of basically the sort of environment-organism interaction and how that expands beyond their immediate needs is one important aspect. So then with form, this is more straightforward, right? This is simply like the morphology, right? The shape and construction of an organism. I put this barrel-eyed fish. If people have seen this, they have a translucent head, so they can actually stare through the top of their own head to see predators. Right, but this is just to say, talking about development, how development affects form, and which kind of feedbacks are involved in morphological diversity. And then lastly, function. And we're going to talk a lot about function, I think next week, a bit today, because this is still, I think, in many ways, the concept of biology that's probably has the most weight put on it, the most investment put on it. And so this is just simply defining or thinking about organisms in terms of what they can do, right? So, function is, something is what it does, right? A heart is a blood pump, right? A hand is a grasping tool, whatever. I put this picture, if people know, these horned toads from the American Southwest. If they're really frightened, they can shoot blood out of their eyes. So, defense mechanism, right? A very functional way to understand something. Okay, so that's all the kind of general preamble to the course. Again, it'll sort of, so these competing, have to deal with these competing narratives, one of which we'll talk about today, the kind of Soviet one. This notion of counter history or counterfactual history. And then how much weight or how much of a bet is put on which philosophical concepts and where, right? Also, I should say, if people have, like I said, there's a bit more of me talking today than hope is normal. People can ask questions in the chat if they want, or if they want to interrupt me, or if you have clarification things, we can do that. I also thought maybe at 4:15, we have like a 5-minute kind of bathroom, cigarette, coffee break, if that's good with everyone, or just to stretch our legs. But yeah, if there's no questions right now, I'll just move on to the kind of main part of the lecture then. So this idea of symbiotics and symbiosis, right? So I mentioned this, right, both with this kind of Margolis story, but also this kind of Soviet story about talking about biology not focusing on the gene, not focusing on the individual, or not focusing on the selfishness, or not focusing on competition, right? In a Darwinian, but even more so, not a social Darwinian way, sort of really has its heyday, right? I would say kind of before the war a little bit, World War II, and then it really kind of has its high point, I think, in through the 60s or into around 60. So talk about sort of how that happened, and how, like I said, that still kind of affects the way people talk about biology in various ways. So first, to kind of talk about the difference, because I think these terms all get thrown around sometimes as if in terms of how much they kind of overlap or don't. So, right, so like symbiosis, right? I think that the picture is pretty self-explanatory, right? Symbiosis is just, right, some kind of close relationship, long-term relationship between two organisms of different species, right? This is very important. And then you have these different forms of it, right? So parasitism is probably the one that people have heard of the most, right? Parasites, right? Something that feeds on you, like you have a, tapeworm or ticks or mosquitoes or whatever, right? They kind of steal resources from another species to survive, right? And the species is harmed to various degrees, the target. But then, of course, you have mutualism, right, which is a kind of, right, both organisms or both partners benefit, right? So again, like bacteria in plant root systems or fungus and with tree systems, all these kinds of things. You think of how various birds that clean insects off of large mammals, right? Both get something out of it. And then commensalism, which is one I don't hear that often, because I think this one almost falls more into this kind of force or process discourse, right? In terms of it's almost more about environment, I think, in a way. And so like a bird in a tree, right? So a bird uses a tree. It's nothing's bad for the tree. It doesn't particularly help the tree either, right? It's just kind of like, okay, it's not damaging, it's not super beneficial, but it's just kind of, it just kind of works. And I mean, because there's many examples to give of this. One of my favorite ones, because I think it's particularly kind of weird, though there's many, is with sloths. So sloths, right, they have this algae that grows on their body. That's why they look green often, like this one. And they have incredibly slow digestive systems. They don't move very much, right? And then they kind of go down, they only go down to defecate, right? So they only go down the tree to poop. And when they're there, all these moths that live on them lay their eggs in their feces, and then the young moths feed on the sloth feces. And then when they're born, when they come to age, they then fly up and live on the sloth. And on the sloth, they sort of eat and live off the nutrients that this moss produces, right? So it's a kind of really super interesting symbiotic relationship, right? Everybody benefits. So between three species, right? Between this kind of plant species, mammal species, and an insect species. And of course it can get even more complicated, but that's a pretty complex one. And so even soon after Darwin's work comes out, right, there's a lot of resistance to Darwinism in the Soviet Union, or even in the pre-Soviet Union. So even like in a lot of ideas, once you get into like the early 20th century, right, there's a lot of resistance to certain notions of Darwin's theory of evolution, right? It's not so much common origin, right, that all life emerged from a shared common ancestor. It's not so much that evolution occurs, right, that there are changes over time that are inherited and passed on, but it's more this notion of competition, right, or survival of the fittest, right? And so many critiques of Darwin, and rightfully so, emphasize that his notion of competition came largely from non-biological theoretical sources, right? So Darwin credited, especially Thomas Malthus, right, who was this quite conservative figure who kind of said, population growth is going to exceed food supply, and so we have like a serious problem on our hands. And so, this idea of competition for limited resources combined with a very kind of English understanding of the economy through people like Adam Smith, right, kind of filled in a real blank for Darwin. And he said this himself, like, this isn't speculation on my part. He says, This competition over limited resources was kind of one of the missing keys in his system for, why things don't kind of, totally, why one species doesn't kind of crash the system. They kind of keep each other in check through competition, and also within a species, right? Competition over limited resources. And so you have kind of the early Soviet thinkers, kind of pushing back against this and saying, well, you could just as easily have this kind of mutualist, right, shared kind of model of sharing or cooperation, right, and still keep everything else the same. And so this is a very typical story. And this dovetails with the Margolis kind of line that I mentioned also, because you have this guy, Merentowski, who comes up with this idea that not only is there symbiosis and complex symbiosis, but some organisms that we think are singular organisms actually are symbionts, right? They're actually made of other species. And he, says this talking about algae and various, sea forms of sea life. People think this is absurd. This cannot be the case. And as like Sheldrake in this book, this Entangled Life book kind of shows also with fungus, like there are many really ancient species which we can't even really say or can't even really talk about in terms of singular species. So, this is a sort of point for mutualism or symbiosis, so this kind of more Soviet sympathetic reading of things, in that, not only is there maybe more cooperation between species or within populations, but some things we might consider a singular species aren't actually a singular species, right? They're already a mutualistic cooperative system. Right? So this is the kind of push on this idea. But what's really a huge impact in terms of how this notion of this sort of more politically conscious notion of biology, also this more Soviet sympathetic notion of biology, one of the big events that causes this to happen is this international congress. So this huge congress is organized in England, and the Soviets send this delegation, right? And they all present these papers, all that are heavily, of course, party approved at the time, 1931. And they really emphasize the fact that, not only does biology have this mutualism and symbiosis and these kinds of things that work in it, but also, science itself is a communistic or social, or at least deeply socialist endeavor. And this Congress has a huge impact, especially on a certain group of British biologists and other scientists as well. And they're called the Red Scientists. And again, people might know this, might be familiar with them or know the work. Haraway's first book, right, based on her dissertation, Crystal Fabrics and Fields, talks about them a bit. So some of them, not all of them, so some of the biologists or some of the scientists influenced by this delegation and by Marxist ideas in the early 20th century were also organicists. And this is the sort of one of the focuses of Haraway's book, right, is that organicism was a kind of an attempt to build a third way between a kind of simplistic view of life as either mechanistic, right, in terms of being mostly about functions, as I said, right, it's kind of functional view of things, or viewing life in various understandings of vitalism, which gets very complicated, but I can answer questions about if people want, right, the idea that life is not chemically or mechanically reducible. There's something particular to life which makes it fundamentally different. And this can be metaphysically stated in the case of someone like Driesch, or it could be simply that, oh no, life is too complex. It's fully material, but it's too complex. And so the organicists, these people that were also very sympathetic largely to Marxist theory, wanted to find a kind of third path, right? Sort of to say, well, there is some use of genetics and functionalist understandings, but this isn't adequate to explain life. But we also don't think you need to use metaphysics, right, to explain life's complexity either. So it's something in between, right? And the kind of Worski's book here, The Visible College, kind of does a really good job of talking about them. These are people like Haldane and Hogben and Joseph Needham, who was a chemist, right? And how also people like Waddington, who kind of came up with this idea of epigenesis, of epigenetics, which we'll talk about, like I said, in the fourth week, was also very sympathetic to this notion. And then John Bellamy Foster's The Return of Nature has a lot about this group and also about how Marxism kind of came and then fell, out of favor for various reasons. Actually, before moving on to that. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, when I mentioned these books by Lily Kay, and I mentioned the influence of money, the sort of two, at least simply historical reasons why Marxist thought got kicked out of biology is that, one, you had this kind of disaster of Lysenkoism, as it was understood, like that led to drought and famine, and like how much of that was science done badly and how much of that was just politics is a question. The other issue, of course, is that some of the people who came to that international congress in England were killed in the purges. And then, the third kind of thing is, as I mentioned with these books by Lily Kay, after the war, right, the Rockefeller Foundation, these kind of big industrialites become the main funders of biological science in the English-speaking world, at least. And of course, given that you're then in the context of the Cold War, they were not going to fund these so-called red scientists and their work anymore. And so you sort of had the end of this influence, in the 50s and definitely by the 60s, in most cases. Of course, we'll talk about this more in depth next week, but you did have some exceptions where people who, of course, were critical of the Soviet Union, but were still sympathetic to the idea that science and that Marxist scientists had something important to say, that even through the 60s, people like Stephen Jay Gould, pictured here, or Richard Lewontin, who, of course, they worked together, saw that in the Marxist work, there was at least a real attempt to understand the political ramifications of one's work. And of course, it's not surprising that once you get to, Vietnam and into the 60s and then into the 70s, that the idea that science could be non-political, right, in the wake of the Cold War was a bit of a joke. And so we'll talk about this more next week when we get into the 1960s, but that's something important to keep in mind, right? That this kind of spirit doesn't completely fade away. Okay. So then just to talk a bit about some of the other important figures and some of the things that happen which are not told in the typical story so much. Is you have research by people like Barbara McClintock, right? So she was somebody that in the 40s and 50s discovered, transposons, right? This idea that elements of an organism could be shifted around, that it could change its own genetic structure in various ways in response to threats. So she studied corn mostly, but we realize it's in other organisms as well. Other organisms can kind of rewrite to a certain degree the genetic structure in response to their environment. Nobody seemed to know what the hell she was talking about or understand her work until much, much later. I think she was awarded a Nobel Prize in like the 1980s, way after the fact. Right, so to say like this is going, so while this kind of genetic story is going on, there's these other people saying, well, things are more complicated, but they weren't really given so much attention. The other thing that's really important that's left out sometimes of this typical history of biology in the early 20th century, so like the 20s and 30s, there's a lot of the work that goes into ethology, right? So the study of animal behavior. So it's really, it kicks off more in the 50s and 60s, but already, in the 20s and 30s, you get these studies of things like Griffin on echolocation, right? People didn't believe this was possible, that bats could actually do this, and he sort of proved it, right? Just measuring the sounds they made and showing like, yes, look, this is how they can actually do this. And also people like von Frisch and other German ethologists showing how bees, could perceive color, could perceive the ultraviolet spectrum. Right, this is very important because a lot of the immediately after Darwin, there was some attempts to talk about the kind of cognitive capacities of animals quite seriously. But these people that did this were quickly dismissed as sort of, putting too much agency, right? Emphasizing agency of the organism too much. And of course, there's a quick shift away from that towards this more functionalist or eventually behaviorist understanding, right? So let's not talk about the inner states of an organism. Let's just see what we can measure, right? And so, but this starts to slowly get undone by various figures. And then also really important work that you have is that, again, as part of this kind of more genetically centralizing discourse, a lot of the interesting work in morphology and development gets less attention. Even though you have some really interesting work by Alan Turing, pictured here, who wrote this kind of really interesting mathematical text about patterns in nature. And this was, just a mathematical update of a much older tradition, of a tradition that, predated Darwin in terms of looking at morphology as a kind of, super important aspect of biological life, but it wasn't seen as like functionally tractable in the same way as some other things. And so it was kind of left to the side. And then this kind of genetic story, right? This idea, this kind of centralizing the importance of DNA gets really, after the discovery of Watson and Crick, it then becomes really called the central dogma by them. And so the idea that like, DNA, RNA, it's like DNA informs RNA, and that tells the proteins of the organism what to grow and develop. That's it, that's the story. And again, kind of leaving out a lot of complexity therein, but this becomes like the kind of driving force. And then, you get you also get the start, which we'll talk about more, as I mentioned, in the third week, but you get the start of, mass productions of medicines and, mass productions of, various kind of biochemicals. So with the polio vaccine, right, with Salk, kind of get this mass production becomes possible. And also you get, some really proper work in terms of the first attempts at in vitro fertilization by Chang, right? So you start to get technical apparatus in the 40s, a little bit in the 50s, that actually allows you to kind of play around with some morphological and developmental things, albeit in a very limited way. The other thing that's important to mention, of course, in this, if we're talking about the Second World War, is this whole question of Nazi science. And this is something that we'll return to when we talk about eugenics, of course, because this whole idea of what counts as science, was a lot of what they were doing even science? I think I would argue no. A lot of the things that they called science weren't actually science. It wasn't actually based on anything other than they had free access to human test subjects. And of course, with this comes, people probably have heard about this, Operation Paperclip, the idea that all these Nazi scientists were repatriated, right, were brought to the US or to the UK or other places, mostly rocket scientists, right, people who would then sort of help with intercontinental ballistic missile program and the space program and this kind of thing. But with this came the problem of what to do with a lot of the research that was done that did appear to be proper science, not in how it was done, but in terms of the results. And this was an ongoing, I mean, it's important to note, I don't think any biologists or physiologists were repatriated, were taken, but some of their work was. And so, and some of the work that was taken that the Nazis did was in particular work on exposure to hypothermia and also exposure to high pressure, right? Because these were both seen as things that were really relevant for pilots, right? And so some of that work was actually used well into, I believe, the 1980s. And with that comes this whole problem, which is still an open debate. I think in general, people don't use it anymore. I mean, now it's so outdated, it doesn't matter, maybe. But the sense is, is it ethical? It seems like it should be unethical to use unethically obtained knowledge. And then, of course, on the other side, people will say, well, people suffered for it. Shouldn't, we do something with it? And yeah, that's really an open question, or was an open question for a long time. But I think what's important and what often gets mistakenly interpreted is this idea that a lot of what they were doing was scientific when it, in fact, was not. And this is, even in the way their work gets translated into English, this is sometimes done, which is very important. So a lot of these Nazi eugenicists would use the word, like talking about heredity. And sometimes nowadays people will translate it into genetic. And that's like a very huge mistake because, their notion of heredity was completely, a complete political construction and had nothing to do with genetics. That they claimed it would, but it didn't, right? So even this is a real problem. Okay, maybe we take, can we say like a 5-minute break? Just so people can kind of, if you need to use the bathroom or whatever, and then we continue. Okay, so I realized that maybe was going a bit fast in terms of there being a bit, maybe too much of a barrage of concepts and things. Like I said, I'm trying to kind of give this kind of broad overview. But so it's a real question if does anyone have any clarification questions or even like general questions before I kind of go through the last bit here. We can also do it after, but if anyone has anything. No. Well, well, then there's just a few more slides. I can kind of go through that. And if people want to return to anything, you can let me know.
I think
So,
Miriam raised her hand.
oh, sorry, I didn't see. Yeah, please.
Hi, yeah, thanks. It's not really kind of a question. Well, it's partly a question. I'm just really interested in what you're talking about already in terms of the mutual exclusivity, of the concept of the singular, the object of biological study and production of knowledge, focusing on the gene, and then the other kinds of objects, maybe on the microbiological level, in terms of symbiosis, with this kind of possible concept of community, and interrelation. And I'm just kind of wondering if any other, philosophical sort of thinkers here might contribute to this mutual exclusivity, of both of those terms would be, let's say, Hobbes, for example, who seems to sort of naturalize, a kind of primitive state of competition between, the human and that, the sort of the state and, civil society is a kind of a mediator, necessary mediator. And then similarly with Kant, you would have the kind of, through his opposition between mechanism and organicism, his sort of defense of the human against, possible scientific reduction, through production of knowledge, that he would also, well, generate this kind of, the concept of autonomy. So I'm just kind of wondering whether, they might also be sort of philosophical. I know this is going back a little bit kind of in history prior to the period that you're talking about here, but yeah.
No, yeah, no, thanks. Yeah, it's a bit tricky. I mean, so on the one hand, there's been, again, like quite recently, there's more and more work about the biological individual, like as like a problem. So
Yeah.
that's one thing. There's a lot of this. Again, like, I mean, really, and of course, that's partially, it's a result of various things. But I mean, one thing it's a result of is not only like more discovering more like kinds of mutualism and symbiosis, but also a lot of forms of life that just don't, they don't easily track in terms of an individual, right? So one of the classic examples is like a coral, right? I mean, certain types of fungus also, but like sea coral, like, what's the difference between a colony and a member? Like, to say there's like a member of a coral doesn't really make sense.
Yeah.
So that's like one big one. And then, of course, and there's various smaller organisms like some fungi that really will change from like a kind of collective state to an individualistic state and then back again. Right. So they'll like compete for who gets to be the head, gets to be like the end of like a tendril. And then when that's over, they go back to being like a mutualistic blob. So there's all kinds of these problems with what's the individual.
Yeah.
But then, one of the complications, I mean, and I'll talk about this a bit in this last part here, but one complication is, as I mentioned, because so much of the philosophy of biology is really heavily analytic, that they don't, and that started in the 60s, they don't like to play metaphysical or ontological games as openly or readily as some more continentally minded folks. So like, and even the way they use Kant, for instance. So that book that I mentioned, this giant philosophy of biology book, this big blue one, you know, you can really see it already even with Kant, because they will read Kant only to the extent that he says, right, organisms, they'll call him a philosopher of biology, which is kind of funny because he didn't think biology was a proper science. I mean, he died basically when it became a proper word. But even they'll take his claims about saying, you know, we should treat organisms or living things as if, right, as if they have purposes. And so they'll take that as like a kind of investigative like method, but they won't then ever want to talk about like, or very rarely want to talk about like what Schelling or Kant or the post, you know, anyone who actually had a philosophy of nature trying to complicate that will do, you know. So that's the other issue. And then I think this will also come up next week with this like levels of selection. And this whole question of levels is really big also. So in the philosophy of biology, even in like the analytic stuff, there's quite a lot of emphasis on levels and like level talk, and whether levels and scale are compatible. Right? And so even there, I think people sort of would be, or like sort of cautious, how do you say, like ontologically cautious analytic philosophers of biology are kind of put in a position of like they kind of have to say, you know, because if you're saying levels and scales are not the same, right? If you're saying it's not just an epistemic thing, right? Because you could say like, you know, okay, scale is epistemic, okay, fine, but like levels, it's like, you know, kind of like, well, it's like a different kind of being together or a different kind of interactions, right? And then so yeah, then you get into these questions of mediation and this kind of thing. But yeah, we'll talk about some of that stuff next week. But thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I can just, this sort of last then section is to kind of talk about some of the issues with continental philosophy, or some like the kind of where the sort of things from continental analytic philosophy kind of bleed into each other a bit. And so one place this is really evident, and you still see this in a lot of contemporary work, is the relationship between cybernetics and biology, right? And so even when you have, on the one hand, you have this very, you know, sort of information or like informatic reading of biology. So especially if you're talking about the genetic program, right? Even this phrase, you're talking about genes as kind of directing the construction, as the kind of thing telling organisms what to build, things like this, telling the proteins what to do. You still have this other understanding from cybernetics or from systems theory later about, you know, what's constraining, like what are the constraints of these biological processes. And so in Schrodinger's work, or in some of these physicists who kind of jumped in to biology in the 40s and 50s, or maybe even 30s, many of them thought there was some possibility to discover or construct biological laws. And in general, some people will go against this claim nowadays, but it's still pretty rare. But for the most part, people talk about rules in biology, and they say that there are no laws of biology. And this, of course, goes to this, one of some of the things I was just talking about in the answer to the question about, you know, because of scales and levels, right? Because it's very hard to say something like this always happens in biology, right? You can say, well, this kind of thing happens at these levels or these scales, but it's not going to happen across the board. So it made more sense. This notion of constraint, which was introduced, as far as I can tell, by this guy Ross Ashby, who was one of the big early figures in cybernetics. And he wrote this kind of the most popular pop book about cybernetics, this introduction to cybernetics. In this book, he sort of talks about constraints, and for him, constraints and laws are almost interchangeable. But really, constraints, if the physicist deals with laws, you might say that the engineer deals with constraints, right? So you sort of know what the laws of physics are, so that constrains what you can actually build, right? In terms of how much data you can take, or how much, what kind of structure something can have based on the material you have, right? These sort of things. And so this notion of constraint becomes really important for how biology, especially in the 20th century, starts to view itself. And with this, and with this, you also have all these notions of feedback, right? Feedback systems. You have people like Gray and these early cyberneticians building, right, these devices that are supposed to imitate, right, certain aspects of living systems. Right. So you have these famous turtles, right? These little robots that they just drive around and respond to light, right? They go towards light and away from less light, and they kind of have a kind of reflex mechanism, and they seem to be lifelike in some way. And at the same time, this notion of constraint really becomes integrated into the humanities, and even more so initially into the social sciences, by way of kind of various notions of structuralism, right? So, you can probably see how the notion of constraint and the notion of structure go quite well together, right? The sense that we're not talking about laws as a kind of universal thing, but we're saying there are these certain structures, right? Certain aspects of living systems, but perhaps also social or cultural systems built on top of those living systems and feeding back with them. That they are law-like in a sense, but they're not really laws, right? So they're sort of general, but they're maybe not completely universal in that sense. And there's a really interesting book, if people know this book by Giogan, Code, which kind of shows how, in particular, the French sort of post-war French tradition became completely obsessed with this notion of informatics, or that kind of came out of cybernetics, but there was less emphasis on this kind of structural constraint angle as being a kind of like real material problem, and more the kind of question of like patterns, right? More, and it's kind of in terms of semiotics, in terms of science systems, right? All of this kind of almost like functionalist language of culture gets sucked up really intensely and quickly by people like Foucault and by Derrida, but also by Saussure and all the and Levi-Strauss and all these people, right? And so, I mean, I bring this up in part because you often see, if you read something like a text about biopolitics, or you look at the sort of various like French theory as kind of resisting the natural sciences in some way, you often don't get the story of how they really, how certain notions from the sciences were completely taken up as conceptually relevant. And so you kind of have to question, what are the different critical functions at work there? Why, for instance, in the French discourse in particular, more functionalist kind of cybernetic adjacent notions were taken up as being like true in some kind of theoretical sense of this, right? As being structurally relevant, whereas other ones weren't, right? And so it's like, what explains this kind of cherry picking of philosophers and theoreticians of biological knowledge, right? And this is like not a straightforward question. And I think it's something that's still very relevant today. You know, if you want to take, I mean, we'll discuss this a bit, but if you take something like, you know, Catherine Malibu and her use of plasticity, right? Like of all the concepts, why take that one? It's like a sort of one that goes beyond its biological, you know, use, or how biological is that understanding once it gets deployed within theoretical texts. But on the other hand, there's a tendency by biologists, which I think is very misguided. And it's really, really common nowadays, or they want to have like a sort of metaphor-free science. All the time, you'll see biologists saying, we don't need metaphors anymore. We don't need to talk about metaphors. Let's not do this. And I think that fundamentally misunderstands the function of metaphors. And it has to do with this unfortunate tendency, maybe in most of the natural sciences, but I know it's definitely true in biology, where, you know, I mentioned talking about revisionary history, right? Or in fiction, right, we talk about like retconning, right? Changing what happened in the story to like allow different stories to happen later. And you see, I think there's a lot of retroactive purification, we might call it, of a lot of scientific discourses, or a lot of texts in biology, where they want to remove the metaphor talk or say the metaphors didn't do anything. And I think that's it's very misleading, because it sort of it adds a certainty to past thinkers that wasn't there. So if they're using metaphors in a useful way, in a kind of pedagogical way, or a way to say it's something like this, but we don't know how it works, but you know, it's somewhere in that direction, that's really important. And not only because it shows like a lack of knowledge or a curiosity about something, but it also shows like the ways in which the mind of the researcher is trying to work or trying to think. So this whole notion of like, let's do science without metaphors, I think is just as naive as this idea of like, let's do this notion of value-free science, right? It's like, it's an ideal. I think value-free science is a good thing to like attempt to do all the time. But to say that we've like achieved that already, you know, post-Cold War is really wild to me. But you see it all the time by contemporary biologists saying this is the case. So this is quite odd. But yeah, I mean, another kind of case, and we'll sort of look at this text and talk about it next week at length, but it's an example, you know, to look at someone like Canguilhem. So there was this, so I said, you know, there was this tradition where all these people kind of took in and got really excited by this information or cybernetic, you know, derived way of talking about living systems, right? And that really starts, you know, they have this with like Levi-Strauss and in the kind of social sciences, but then even philosophers in France and post-war France, especially even like with Foucault, become really enamored by this, you know, informational kind of, you know, DNA as a kind of writing, or right, the script. We're talking about lock and key and all these kinds of ways of speaking about the molecular sciences or molecular biology, which will be the focus next week. But it's also like the end of a particular philosophical tradition, which I think is really interesting, where Canguilhem is probably the last of them, where, you know, he was really concerned with what kinds of concepts scientists were using, but he also tried to really understand the science that was being done. And so he didn't have this, he sort of had a political orientation, but he wasn't, he didn't code biology in overtly political terms in a way that like Foucault would go on to do, I would say. But he also himself admitted, which, you know, is something that you don't see so much anymore, towards the end of his life in an interview, that he didn't understand molecular biology. And he sort of said, like, this is beyond me. I don't really know what's happening anymore. And, you know, for him, he'd made a lot of claims about what happens in the laboratory and what's understood, you know, and, you know, he had a lot of real medical knowledge and physiological knowledge about, you know, medicine and the history of pathology and this kinds of stuff. But there was, I think there was this time where where there was a philosophy of biology that was continentally focused and also politically and ethically aware that really ended with Canguilhem. And there's a really nice recent book that addresses a lot of this work by Zukanakati, this organism-oriented ontology book, where she kind of goes over this kind of mostly French tradition, that kind of preceded Canguilhem, but also what preceded Canguilhem. And I mean, what's interesting there is that in that, there was a real emphasis on organisms, or understanding the kind of continuity between organisms and human beings in a kind of a functionalist way, right? In the sense of, humans and animals are both defined by what they can do, but there must be some kind of continuity between them. Right? And this is often talked about in terms of like this notion of organology, right? This idea of reading life forms in terms of how they can, of what their various functions are, and how they can also exteriorize themselves in some way, right? How can they record their actions or affect their environments in some kind of long-standing way? And, it was in thinkers like, Simondon, and also Raymond Ray, who's less well-known, who really attempted, to sort of have like a deep philosophical understanding of living systems. And with Simondon in particular, and this is, why I thought the Schrödinger text is important to look at, is that the Simondon's work kind of shows not only a really strong attempt to sort of think deeply about the concepts of biology, why biology is important to philosophy, but also that there's concepts or things happening in biology, or things learned from biology or from living systems, that kind of trouble a lot of our easy ontological assumptions. And this also goes to part of the question that was asked, right, in terms of the individual, right? I mean, Simondon is a good example of somebody who's yet trying to think around or think without the individual in this kind of straightforward sense, right? That it's about the coming to be. How does an organism come to be through its developmental processes, rather than assuming that it's some kind of, that it's some kind of straightforward system. Yeah. So there was something in the chat. Okay, yeah, so a question about, how do this thinking about constraint and structure become a form of abstraction? Yeah, I think it's also, this question of like how it becomes abstract. I think part of what happens is, I think it does become, I think this notion of constraint, or a lot of the notions from cybernetics, become abstracted, and basically, I think starting partially through this notion of semiotics, right? So like thinking about life as this kind of sign recognizing system, and also in terms of kind of different ideas of writing. And this also comes, I think this is kind of the result, the ultimate, and I think somewhat unfortunate result of the impacts of someone like Simondon and also Rouet, because the idea of living systems, or I should say, human beings are seen or treated, I think, in a lot of the kind of structuralist and then postmodernist discourse as being different from other organisms, because they can exteriorize their knowledge and their life in these more complex sign systems, right? Which you could just say that's, that's culture, or, or people, and I think, whereas like Simondon and Rouet both we're trying to see like a deep continuity between thinking and living systems, like how consciousness could emerge from living systems, and what were the more general traits of living systems that cognitive systems were just kind of an expression of. But I think it's very easy to turn this, if you sort of stop looking at the sciences as a kind of interesting ground, and you sort of say, okay, yes, human beings express or exteriorize their knowledge in a way that makes them fundamentally non-biological, like that makes them escape their biology, right? And so, I mean, it gets very complicated. And I mean, essentially, this is what Bergson argues in Creative Evolution, right? He really likes this notion of humans as homo ludens, right? So, you know, humans as the tool-making creature. And so this idea of tool making, this idea of, you know, this whole thread of memory, right? And like the materialization of memory in the French tradition. Yeah, really going, like this becomes, I think, slowly turns into that humans' cultural capacities kind of break them out of biological systems. I think you see this with Derrida. I think you kind of see it with Foucault, but not quite in the same way. So there's, you know, on the one hand, there's less of a reliance upon metaphysical or maybe ontological claims about like a deep continuity between humans and non-humans. And then with that, you have less emphasis on the details of the sciences used to ground those claims in people like Simondon. And so humans become these kinds of culturally separate, but still living beings. But because like this is the kind of weird trick, I guess, with Foucault, we'll talk about more next week, because there's real like evidence of how he actually took this from certain biologists. But the sense that information, right, becomes the gene, but also information becomes the most meaningful metaphor or way of reading biology that actually allows humans and their capacity to create information to make them less biological. So I think it's kind of a strange trick that happens, sort of post-Foucault in particular. So, and I guess, yeah, I mean, it's just Samantha's comment about post-human and humanism. I think this is also, it's also like a real complex problem or something really problematic about this notion of biopolitics, or how biology becomes, or I should say, how French philosophy of biology after Canguilhem essentially becomes absorbed into biopolitics. And so then if you read biology in the way that Foucault does, as this like historical attempt to construct a certain type of knowledge to control certain types of, or certain aspects of life, then, you know, that's sort of makes the sciences sort of subordinate to the humanities in a particular way. And so, as I already mentioned, I think one problem with that is it makes people stop reading science if they're in the humanities. And Foucault, I mean, I like Foucault for a lot of reasons, but his reconstruction of the history of biology is bizarre. His genealogy of biology, and not only because it's a genealogy, right, and he's tracing certain conceptual movements, but it's very, very French. Like it champions French figures over other figures simply, it seems simply because they're French, not for any other reason that I can tell. And so I think part of the danger there is if biology or the natural sciences are viewed as an extension of the kind of power of humans as, you know, lawmaking, normative beings, or whatever you want to say, then it's very easy for that to also, I mean, the other kind of bad effect of that, besides not looking at the science anymore, is it risks becoming monocultural, or it risks becoming deeply Eurocentric. right? So if you sort of abandon metaphysical ontological claims and say you're doing something more pluralistic and open because you're doing biopolitics instead of philosophy of biology. But if the cultural touchstones you use for that are these very Eurocentric ones, then biopolitics can end up reduplicating the discourse of biopolitics can end up reduplicating the crimes, like sort of biopolitical crimes of the 20th century by asserting that humanness and life and these kinds of things are determined by a certain understanding of like European norms, for instance. I mean, this gets very complicated. We'll talk about this in the fourth week a bit. I'll talk about Sylvia Wynter, as a kind of critique of this, right? That if you mistake the European man for the human, right, then you risk you either sort of reduplicate a very narrow notion of the humanities, or if you then kind of have a post-human mode against that, which lots of post-human discourse will take from people like Simondon or maybe Whitehead or Deleuze or whatever, right? Because they see them as not falling into this trap of being too much about culture and forgetting about the sciences. But then if you kind of do this post-human move, you still have to address the kind of human you're moving beyond, right? Was never really human, right? It was only like a certain genealogical construction of the human from this biopolitical viewpoint. Yeah, which is why I think Canguilhem is such a important figure, because he's really the kind of pivot between these ways of understanding things. And it also requires, and I mentioned this more at the outset when I said, the fact that the philosophy of biology is very analytic, and so it has concerns of analytic philosophy, right? It talks about, it's worried about set theory and logical categories and causality and things like this. This really erases a lot of the really interesting work and very important work that was done in the 1800s and in the early 1900s by people like Woodard and Beckner, who are pictured here, who were really trying to figure out which concepts are biological, like what, because you talk about philosophy of biology, right? There's going to be some historical component, because you have to talk about certain instances of things being discovered, or you talk about research paradigms, or you talk about problems, or you talk about concepts. You have to have some way of making biology as a practice readable to philosophy. But then, of course, you always have this problem of how much is the construction you're going to do going to limit the kinds of biological experiments or biological work that you look at. And so I think this is kind of an ongoing problem, which again, as I mentioned at the very beginning, why though philosophical works on biology, they can be pretty good historically, but they're often not very good politically. And like political or like biopolitical or other like critical theory texts on the politics of biology can be pretty good philosophically, but then they often are very selective historically, right? So you kind of have this constant game of trade-offs, it seems, which is what I'm trying to avoid in the class. Right, there seems to be this kind of unfortunate trade-off between history, philosophy, and politics in terms of how you want to read the stuff. And yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to find some kind of balance between this. And I think in part, so there has to be a kind of genealogy done on the analytic side of thing to kind of revive these kinds of books. that were seen as not necessary to this initial moment in the 60s of kind of refounding philosophy of biology by Anglophone thinkers. But then you also need to kind of look back at the continental side of things and to not let an overly narrow view that is convenient for biopolitical purposes sort of become the norm. As I mentioned, it leads to a real asymmetry in terms of like the knowledge, like basic knowledge of how certain biological sciences or studies work. And then the kind of stopgap measure that you have between these modes is science and technology studies or sociology of science. But as some people have critiqued, these tend to be political, but they tend to be micro-political in a very limiting way. So they will, for instance, talk about the history of the lab rats, do like 100-year history of various model organisms, or the history of how a certain virus was discovered or something like this. But then they will also often focus so much on the details, providing useful, interesting details about how the experiments were done, what were the very specific, very granular readings of the motivations of the experimenters, things like this. But then it becomes so focused that it doesn't then have kind of broader political view that the biopolitical works do have. So again, you have this constant game of like, what's the right scale or level to focus on at what time. And so the sort of last thing I would say is there are a few books which do, I think, at least a decent job of trying to deal with several of these problems at once. And this book by Morange, is sort of my go-to sort of history book, because he attempts to do, it doesn't have so much philosophy, it does have some, but at least it tries to find a good balance between the historical and the political aspects in a kind of way that Anglophone or analytic philosophers would be open to and read. So I think that's something that's very important, and it's quite rare, I would say. Okay. So that's the bulk of that's all the like proper lecture slides that I have. So we can do some kind of nuts and bolts things, but also, are there any more questions about anything from today that anyone wants to ask, or about the class in general? In the chat. Okay. Thanks. Okay, so this is just the kind of practical things. Yeah, this is the kind of format I used last time. So if people can get into groups, because it depends on how many people are in the course, and since there's only 3 weeks, maybe the group should be bigger. But it really depends on what people want to do, right? To sort of just do like a short discussion of one of the texts. I'll also put up some optional texts or extra optional texts that people just want to look at them if there's something in particular they're interested in. And then, yeah, then it's just the paper, which is to kind of, to really kind of focus on the conceptual side of things, but that can be discussed if you want to do something else, but just a sort of short and to the point kind of research paper. Let's see, yeah. So, but with that, Yeah, there's no more slides or anything. Yeah, so if people have, do people have any questions again, practically? Okay, yes. Oh, yes, thank you. So there's a sign-up sheet for the presentations. So if there's a particular text that you're interested in, good to do that sooner rather than later. Yes, Arnav?
Ben, I was actually intrigued by what you mentioned about vitalism and its political and philosophical uh, ramifications in the first half of the 20th century. I was thinking that vitalism, for numerous reasons, were appropriated by the fascists and the Nazis, and many and it also seduced many artists to actually use it in their employ it in their work. Now, the thing is, as for the Nazis, they use vitalism to justify the atrocities on Jews. But there has been a counter a counter tradition among the Jews who actually employed vitalism to demonstrate the superiority of the Jewish people. One instance of this is the Kabbalist and philosopher Oscar Goldberg. So I was thinking, is this a tradition in which one or two figures are only there, or is this a larger tradition that hit back at what the Germans and the Nazis were doing with vitalism?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, usually from my understanding, at least, the type of biology that the Nazis seem to use the most, or I'd say kind of put the most weight on, was would be holism. And so holism is often confused with organicism. They're not quite the same. But holism isn't, it's kind of funny thing. It's like holism is not necessarily vitalistic, but I think it shares some tendencies. So holism in biology, at least the way that the Nazis really, took it up, right, is the way that life and living systems are part of an integrated whole. And the kind of metaphor, right, that they would use generally is that a society or a culture is like an organism,
Yes.
right? And like this organism is open to the out. It's, it should be naturally, right, this harmonious and healthy and all these things. But of course, like any other living body, it can become infected, right, or invaded by some kind of outsider or disrupting element. Of course, you can see where this is going to go.
Yes.
Right? And so to me, and that kind of holism comes in part from this kind of tradition of Lebensphilosophy, right, which is a philosophy which gets confused with vitalism. But I would say, I think it's a similar thing with what I said, some of the problems with biopolitics is that Lebensphilosophy reads biology through culture while kind of claiming, to be like, when they say, a society or a culture is like a living organism, they're sort of relying upon the authority of biology there by saying, we know this is true of organisms, so it should, why isn't it true of cultures? But in fact, right, they're taking the sort of liveliness of life, right? But it is really a philosophical understanding, right? They're talking about life with like a capital L. Like it's almost a theological or existential form of
Yes,
life that they're hiding behind talking about the organism. And of course, this is why people think they get confused with the organicists. But in fact, no, it's about the health and harmony of this supposedly closed system that is still possible to threaten. Because I would say in terms of like vitalists, otherwise, so like because the Leibniz philosophy people, life is teleological and definable that way, whereas for vitalists, some of them might say there's a teleological element, but many vitalists will say you can't even say there's a teleological element, right? And of course, that is not something that's politically useful to fascists. And also this, of course, the health of the closed or semi-closed body is, of course, the most tempting metaphor of all, right? Because then you can call anybody a virus or a sickness or a threat, and
yes,
and cure them, right?
yes,
So it's
absolutely.
very complicated.
Thank you, Ben. And and what you said reminded me of the closed organism and the threat from the outside. Isn't this a, a 19th century way of thinking called analogical thinking? It was also applied in spiritualism, and like its parallels with uh, humans as mediators and doorways from other dimensions. So it's like a parallel way of thinking.
Yeah, well, and I mean, there was also direct connections between some of the Lebensphilosophy people, which, even Bergson's late work falls into this. Some of Nietzsche's work falls into this. And so, yeah, I would say the stepping stone would be theosophy, right? So I'd say you have these like, mid 1800s to like early 1900s theosophy, or even spiritualists of certain types, right? Talking about, this is why I say the life of the Lebensphilosophen is like a big L life, right? It's like life in the sense of like the meaning of life. And so that's very compatible with, yes, this idea that, humans are just animals, but because of spirit, then you can use these semi-biological metaphors of health, that health also reflects something more than health. Right, which of course was also something very central to the Nazis, right? Aryanness wasn't just about, there were outward signs of Aryanness in terms of physiology, but what really mattered, right, was the traits or the spirit, right, of it. Right, Hitler wasn't an Aryan, right? Right, he didn't have blonde hair, blue eyes, but he had the spirit, so that's fine. So yeah, that's, I think, and this whole kind of health discourse and its relationship to a kind of a certain form of a theosophy, yeah, I mean, is a huge part. All these things are kind of connected in that kind of really early 20th century, yeah, kind of nationalistic attempt to rebuild the people of the nation and stuff like this, yeah.
Thank you, Ben.
Okay, I'm not sure who was next. Was it Sarush?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the great lecture. The point that Arnold also said, but reminds me of what the theory, what Agamben says about this separation between bios and zoe, and also the fact that there is also all the time there is some appendix, something actually added to the concept of maybe, and there is some conception of a pure life, and there's something added to it maybe by Nazis, and all kinds of different things that fall under the general category of biopolitics. Like what Derrida says about focusing on health itself as when life is regarded as something to be protected, and this emphasis on life as something to be defended and protected. I don't know if it comes from some biological conceptions or what, but this is maybe the basic thing that is used by the Nazis. Some kind of, it's paradoxically some kind of over fascination with the greatness of life, which leads to some ideology that tries to purify it, maybe. And I guess maybe we could look at it from this perspective too.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's yeah, I mean, that's why, like, if many people will kind of try to claim that, I mean, several people have tried to make the claim that, for instance, the Nazis were Darwinians because they put so much emphasis on struggle, right, on Kampf or whatever. But, you know, far more important to them, which if you read, you know, they borrow stuff from Darwin, you know, in like the Wannsee conference, and then when they have, you know, they kind of construct the final solution, they steal language more from social Darwinism than from Darwin. But it's really clear they did not like evolution, right? And this is to your point, right? The idea that life is something that yeah, has to be protected, so that change, right? There's progress, but this progress has to be somehow already internally defined, right? I can't do with, you know, so there can be a little bit of change, but really the biggest problem of change is the threat of something else poisoning the already healthy, right, pure body, right? And this is why, you know, the Nazis and the Nazi discourse on biology was so much more invested in this kind of this you know, pseudo you know, this idea that there's a capacity for certain types of people or certain types of life to become ever greater, and if they become sick or they become degenerated, right, this kind of language they used to live, it's because of others interfering or like not, or like doing something sneaky, right, to infect and undermine and sicken and disrupt and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, this whole discourse about defending the life that's already good from the beginning, yeah, is like completely this bizarrely like physiological but really spiritualized kind of body, right? It's not like a real body. It's a body that's biological to the sense it can get infected, you know, so you can justify the destruction of certain people and elements. So it is this very strange, you're right to say it's this very strange logic of defense. Senza?
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, nice to meet you. So, also, thank you for the lecture. It seems that the Nazi thing caught the attention of most of us, since all of the questions have been driven to that direction. And mine is kind of trying to address that as well. But I was thinking based off of what has been discussed throughout this session in particular. So, since there's this precedent of disavowal towards quote unquote scientific practices in the Nazi regime, given the fact that mostly it was driven by propagandistic political interests related to the geopolitical context of Nazism. For example, what you mentioned, there's not that much of a difference besides the fact that they did have access to eugenic driven or eugenic interests where the subject of experimentation was this human being.
Yeah.
That was the main difference, you could say. But wouldn't it be the same to say from the mystic dimension of these pro-eugenics political movements? I was thinking about this because, I mean, there's like this whole like revisionism from I don't know, people which have like esoteric interest, which try to revision the fact that there's this dimension has something prolific inside the Nazi movement. But there is this same argument of application of sciences, of natural sciences, also in the esoteric aspect or the mystical dimension of the Nazism. I was only wondering if it could be something one could consider from the same lens, from the same perspective, or if those are things which do not overlap.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think they do overlap. It depends on like what flavor of Nazi esotericism you are looking at, probably. I mean, the easiest point of overlap, I would say, or one of them, is the pseudo-anthropology of the Nazis. And again, right, this wasn't something special or specific to the Nazis. There was tons of this going on in Europe, many other places in the turn of the
Yes.
century. And so like this whole notion of lost lands, right? So like one of the easy examples of this would be this notion that all these fraudulent anthropologists and archaeologists like rejected the idea that the Maya or the Egyptians or Sumerians or whoever you pick could not have possibly have been as great. How could they have been so great and so technologically talented and da-da-da? And of course, this is why the Nazis loved this crap that they keep showing on the History Channel, you know, like
Yeah.
the alien astronauts, right? So like we're so racist that we would rather believe that aliens built the pyramids than these, you know, non-white people did. But this was like a really intense kind of research construction, and it goes, I mean, one of the connecting points is this degeneration thing I mentioned, and this notion of you know, this idea of recapitulation, right? So this concept that was very important to Ernst Haeckel, who was loved to an extent by the Nazis. They later turned against him, and he was called the German Darwin. But right, this idea that, right, this recapitulation is, you know, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, right? So the development of the individual repeats the development of the species. Right, so this is this notion that like if you could watch the embryo of a thing grow, it would go through like a fish phase and then a pig phase and then a lizard phase, and then it would come out what it was supposed to be. And so this logic is that this then got applied to cultures. So the notion was that white European culture was the original human culture, was the oldest one, and these other ones were kind of like branched off from that, but that sort of white European culture contained all of them within it because it was like the most complete one from the beginning. This is really strange temporal logic. But then once people started discovering, you know, Aztec and Mayan temples and things like this, like Eurocentrism, which of course Nazism was a big part of, could not accept that the New World, as they literally called it, for instance, could be older than Europe. So it's really strange. But this is where the biological and the anthropological kind of collide in a really interesting way. Because you're basically saying there must have been an original, even older culture that was the proper. And this is where you get all these people saying Atlantis was the original Aryans, or Aryans were kidnapped and taken to Mars, or you get all these crazy versions of this. But it's all in this attempt to basically say that the sort of originally spiritual and cultural practices of the oldest people in the world were the most pure and European and hence Aryan. And so all the other peoples and cultures are just degenerated forms of that. And so we, you know, the Nazis, are the only ones who are still being true to our roots. So it's always like, it's like kind of esoteric, it's kind of biological, it's kind of anthropological, you know. I mean, it's really complicated. I mean, it sounds like you know this stuff too. But I mean, that's why, you know, I think the Nazis are, I mean, that kind of project in general of like reconstructing Europeanness was global, right? Especially leading up to and after World War I. It's also why eugenics was everywhere, not only in Nazi Europe, but the Nazis, of course, like really added this. Yeah, I mean, I think sort of added this kind of spectacular dimension to it, which there was. I mean, I think it was also, this spiritual dimension was also a way for the Nazis to choose who their people really were. you know. I think that's why the spiritual dimension is always maintained, because you can always kind of decide, oh, these people are actually Aryan too, right? You think about these adventures that the Nazis did into Tibet to say, oh yeah, maybe you're also Aryan because we like your religious values. I mean, that's
I was actually thinking about what you were just mentioning because, for example, I live here in Ecuador, which is very fucked up, and it's in the middle of nowhere in South America. It's great. Being in Latin America is great, but you know, third world issues, which are like real issues, like having scarcity and no resources. And I think about this because the exact dynamic of the Nazi intervention in Tibet is the same thing which happened with the Nazi ideology spreading and in a way kind of cementing the way in the of the political background of Latin America after the Second World War, mostly because most of them migrated to Argentina and Brazil, and you can see here, like actually, like how those people say now, no cap. Um, you can really see that people do believe that shit. The question here is now thinking about this overlapping of mysticism, which I think is having some sort of resurgence with camouflage with the idea of conspiracy theories, but which also works in the magical realm of the mind, the magical thought, as they say.
Yeah.
Why are these tales, even as the years go by, and we are more technologically infused and induced, and our lives are more technologically driven, for example, regarding cybernetics, how come those tales are more cohesive and conveying for people than sciences?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is, I mean, also, one of the one of the people that invented wellness and what's called health, practical health in Germany were the Nazis. So you had this kind of really weird loophole where the Nazis in the 30s created laws where people could practice medicine, in scare quotes, or health practices, which meant any kind of esoteric thing. And this is still the law today. They never got rid of it. So you can go, get whatever crazy treatment you want. And they don't, without having a medical degree, of course, because one way it was seen as a way to get around the sort of Jewishly, controlled universities in their minds. But it was also, so central to eugenics and to this reconstruction of naturalism and this reconstruction of a people as, this is also why they didn't talk about genes, right? They talked about blood, right? Because blood is about a people, it's about a practice, it's about a culture, it's not about the actual material stuff. And it's also why, I think an individualistic form of this has become very popular today. I think that's part of the question. I think for the Nazis, there was a collectivity to it in terms of this kind of holistic defense. But I think now it's just become individualized. And I think that's why it's so strongly connected to conspiracy theories. There's actually a book called Conspirituality, if you want to look at it, which is pretty great, which shows this. But I think it's because the health in the body in these kinds of practices is always going to be as esoteric or as physical as you want it to be, and that you get to decide. And I think this is ultimately why these things are kicking off now. And it's become a kind of trend on the alt-right in general. And even this lost land thing is really popular in Russia. Alexander Dugin is really into this, some of these like mystical land stuff. Because that also, if you define a people spiritually, right, then you can invade someone's land, right? Because then their territory is not a real territory, because that's not the real bounds of the people. And so, yeah, I think this is the real crazy, or one of the craziest aspects. But yeah, we'll talk about this. Yeah, I actually put in more. I mean, it's a bit, well, it's not funny, but the fact that everyone's asking questions about the
I'm sure it
Nazi
is.
stuff. No, it is funny in that sense, but I was actually going to put more stuff about Nazis, but then I thought maybe I shouldn't do that because it's a bit hard for people to stomach, especially if you read the the accounts of the experiments which I have done, which is not, you know, not something I recommend. But we will talk more about this. I guess not so much explicitly in the Nazi context, but in both the third and fourth class, we'll talk about the alt-right, and like with the rebirth of eugenics, a lot of this is going to come up. How eugenics has come back and in what form, and how it's also has this kind of two-faced format in a way, right? That it has this kind of esoteric theosophic form, but it also has this, science is neutral. We're just collecting data. This is empirical, open science, like the kind of stuff they do in the Netherlands, especially. Well, and by well, I mean terribly. Yeah, so it still has this kind of this weird duality. So this will come up again, for sure. So maybe lastly, yeah, mindfulness. Yes, that's. But someone asked about Freud, and yeah, Freud does come into this. It's a really complicated story. Yeah, I don't know if he's going to come up again, but this way of this kind of, I mean, I'd say Freud's notion of like the kind of system, this kind of defense mechanism, and that part of the body has to kind of be hardened or destroyed to kind of save the rest in this kind of, psychic biological picture. I think probably in Civilization and Discontents, I want to say, he's borrowing a lot from Lamarck, and so there's something really interesting in Freud. He's told by one of his students, I think it's Ferenczi, who basically tells him, you should reread Lamarck, you should reread this kind of sort of non-Darwinian kind of forms of evolution and recapitulation, and see if that maybe relates to you. And I think there's this kind of moment where Freud kind of starts to tilt back into biology from where he started with, proto-neuroscience. And then in that later works, he kind of goes back into that. But yeah, that would actually be I don't know if anyone's done this, but it'd actually be interesting to read also in terms of one of the first questions about this kind of anti-Aryan or like, sort of Jewish construction of a people in that way, this kind of diasporic construction against this maybe other nationalistic health notion. It might be something interesting, but I don't really know what else to say about that. Yeah, but with that, I guess we are pretty much out of time. Yeah, so I mean, we didn't really talk about Schrödinger so much at length, but it was mostly just so that people kind of got a sense of what biology was like in the period. Next week, the reading is much shorter. And there's also the optional reading, which I think is Kangiam. But we'll really talk about molecular biology, so really talking about the 60s, and with that sociobiology, so how people start to try to draw conclusions about behavior from this kind of genetic or gene-centric understanding. And then we'll kind of complicate. I didn't put this on the original syllabus, but I think we'll end the next week by talking about the sort of evolution of sex and how like game theory and like readings of sex as, gene-centric or not kind of complicate the kind of way of trying to read behavior as sort of straightforwardly molecularly determined in a kind of easy way. And so that also, of course, has political implications. Yeah, so with that, thank you, everyone, and I hope to see you next week.
Thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ben. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was really great.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. It was great.
Thanks.